So I'm delighted to be bringing in Matt Finch, who is the UK Policy Manager for Transport and Environment, the highly respected Brussels-based NGO. Matt has worked on climate change policy for the past decade and joined TNE earlier this year. His focus has been on aviation and UK electric vehicle policy. Prior to that, he was director of a mid-sized consultancy. Matt, I think will be keeping us real in the discussion for the rest of the EV Summit EY online series. Matt, thank you for joining us today. As with all of our speakers, please do pose your questions in the Q&A tab. Matt, the digital floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Aid. Yeah, so I'll look at things from the normal aviation point of view. So as the previous speakers have said, there's a few ways to decarbonise aviation. Sustainable aviation fuel, zero emission aircraft and better efficiencies are very good things that we should do. There's also flying less, which no one from the industry mentions. Flying less actually has the most bang for its buck from an environmental point of view. It doesn't just save carbon, but it also saves the non-CO2 emissions, which over a 100-year period, non-CO2 emissions have 3 times the climate impact of carbon dioxide. And is never discussed. We do need to start discussing that more. Better efficiencies are a no-brainer, and it's great that people like companies like Rolls-Royce are constantly tweaking and making their engines better. The problem is the average plane lasts for 20 to 40 years, and so it takes time for new planes to work through the fleet. And as the fleet the global fleet is expanding, we're gradually putting more and more carbon into the air, or we were up until the pandemic. Zero emission aircraft really are the panacea. We want these. We absolutely should be throwing everything at them. And the worldwide market for them is potentially huge. So 45% of flights are under 500 miles globally. There's about 9,000 aircraft that seat less than 100 people. UBS, the investment bank, thinks the market could be worth £178 billion. So huge, and Katie will have a big smile on her face right now. But, and there's a big but here, the share of European emissions that correspond to planes of less than 80 people flying less than 1,000 kilometres, i.e. where we expect zero emission aircraft to be in 20, 25 years, is only 2.3%. Most of the emissions problem from aviation comes from long haul flights. And so the only way to tackle that is via sustainable aviation fuel. Now, 2 big problems with SAF. Firstly, obviously, it costs a lot more than fossil kerosene. Secondly, the industry right now is tiny. As mentioned by a previous speaker, it's 0.1% by volume. So supply chains don't exist. Production facilities just don't exist. We couldn't suddenly turn on the taps and have lots of SAF tomorrow. The question, therefore, for policymakers is, how do we increase the amount of SAF that's being supplied into the mix far more rapidly than the industry was doing? So UK and Europe, the UK and the European Commission have settled on proposing a mandate. And that's where suppliers have to supply increasing volumes of SAF over the years, ultimately getting to quite a high level in 2050. There's 2 types of SAF. So the first is waste-based SAF. There's a problem with this. There's always a problem. And it's constrained by the amount of waste we produce. The second type is e-kerosene, and e-kerosene is where you make the fuel using green hydrogen and captured carbon. But to do that, and to do that environmentally, you need zero carbon electricity, and you need huge amounts. So my NGO, Transport and Environment, calculated the numbers, and in 2050, we'd need about 103 terawatt hours. For context, that's about 1/3 of all electricity use in the UK. So it's something that we might be able to do if we really went for it now, but realistically, how do we reduce the amount of zero carbon electricity needed? And then you start going back up the chain. How do you increase the demand for zero emission aircraft? Well, that's actually quite easy. You require airlines to use them. At some point in the future, we would like to see some form of zero emission miles flown mandate, which is where governments would require airlines to fly certain routes, not using fossil fuels. Then you have to look at efficiencies again. I mentioned the problem of planes and some planes lasting for 40 years. You're going to have to start requiring airlines to scrap their planes earlier. Big knock-on effects there, with CFOs will be jumping up and down at me saying that, but it's the only way to do it, to get these efficiency gains. Or how do you reduce demand? Lots of ways to actually reduce demand. One such way via taxes. So airlines don't pay fuel duty, which incidentally means that anyone who's ever filled up their car has paid more fuel duty than British Airways. Applying a kerosene tax would correct that social problem, but also make SAF look more attractive. But realistically, if you want UK aviation to get anywhere close to net zero by 2050, you have to start doing a lot of measures, implement a lot of policies, something that we at the moment don't have planned. Back to you, Aid.
Matt, thanks very, very much indeed for that. I think if I could paraphrase, your key message is stop the faff on SAF. So I'll go over to some questions from our online audience. The first one of which is, do you think the consensus that sustainable aviation won't be available for the next few decades is accurate? A pretty searching question, that one.
Yeah, so the short answer is yeah. For the next decade, certainly not. We just don't have the production facilities to make SAF or the planes in existence. Zero emission planes in existence, but after that, you can have a brilliant plane, but an airline has to buy it and fly it. You can have production facilities, but fuel suppliers have to use them, supply the fuel, and the airlines have to buy it. And at the moment, we don't have policies that require airlines to be more sustainable. So we have some announcements from some progressive airlines, notably British Airways, but nothing from EasyJet, Ryanair, Jet2, Wizz Air, etc., etc., etc. So yeah, short answer is next decade, no chance. Decade after that, potentially.
I did suspect you'd keep us real, Matt, and I think you certainly are doing that. The next question is, would you advocate a personal tax or charge for frequent long distance flyers, or do you think these changes should come from governments?
The changes have to come from governments ultimately. Would I advocate a frequent flyer levy, which is, I suspect, what the question is? It's not a bad tax, because in the UK, 70% of flights are taken by 15% of people. So the problem isn't a UK-wide problem; it's a rich people in the UK problem. I think the aviation industry should pay more tax, i.e. a kerosene tax makes perfect sense, because everyone pays fuel duty. It's part of the taxation system that we tax public bads, and things that produce carbon are public bads.
Okay, thanks very much indeed, Matt. Final question before we hand over to we bring our panel back to ask questions of each other. So this is quite a long question, but it says, you say that long haul flights are the most emitting in relation to carbon, and the only way to reduce this is via SAF or reducing demand. Question, would you recommend things such as cargo being sent in other means, such as sea freight, or ultimately do businesses shipping cargo look at both cost and transit times? So do you think it's not viable to go over to meet this demand via other means?
It depends on the cargo, actually. And again, certainly increasing the costs of flying cargo would change the economics of sea versus air. Saying that, a lot of cargo actually comes in the belly of passenger aircraft. And so this is a good use of space, that if you presume that the plane's going to fly anyway. It's a slightly, you have to give a nuanced answer to that question, but there's no right or wrong answer.
Okay, very, very good. Thanks very much indeed, Matt.